Well, good morning and afternoon, because it is morning for me, but it is afternoon for you. And my name is Kathleen Kelm, and welcome. We have had quite an interesting day. I've been popping in and out of the various sessions. Lots of things to think about. One of the parts about digitizing higher education is to think in terms of the technology, but then also thinking in terms of where does that take us? And so what I hope today is to leave you with a few things to think about. I'm going to ask that we move the slide ahead if we could. Uh, that'll allow us to get into the agenda. I'm just going to wait for that to pop over so we can just get over it. Thank you very much. So the agenda for this afternoon's talk is, first of all, to establish some common understandings. It is, some of the words we're going to be using or the concepts are deeply seated in either research or they're ones that we're very familiar because as faculty members or members of an academic institution, we're aware of what they mean. But it's a good idea to go through them and make sure that we level set where we're going. The focus today is to talk about student engagement and the learning environment, and what does that mean, digitization? Peer student engagement and assessment. Many of you are already engaged in that kind of work. We've had some excellent conversations as well about digitization and learning, and I'm going to do a little bit about student collaboration within the curriculum piece and give you some examples. I do want to integrate within these conversations the use of technology and the whole notion of digitizing. What does that mean? We've been doing a lot of it in the last 2 years. It certainly has been something that before the pandemic, there were some pushes to digitize, first in the online world, then on campus. Then, of course, COVID-19 hit. The pandemic took us away from our physical environment and moved us into using technology. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well. And then I'd like to encourage you to have further conversations and, of course, any questions and answers. So next slide, please. So what's interesting about, perfect. Yes, thank you, that's it. So what's interesting about the notion of digitizing higher education is that when we talk about this, we're always going to have, and don't mean to exclude them, but from my perspective, we're going to be looking at it from a faculty and a student perspective. That does not mean that the administration is not part of the conversation, but in some ways, the administration provides a supporting role as we start thinking about how this digitization can be actualized in the experiences, both from a faculty and a student perspective. So we've certainly been doing some of this already. It's not to say that we haven't, but it pops out some questions about teaching and learning from a digital perspective. So as educators, what are we expecting? What are our end goals? So in other words, are they the same? Is the faculty end goal and the student end goal the same? And the answer would probably be maybe and maybe not. Something to consider. Because if we're going to talk about collaboration, some of the things that we'll want to talk about. How are learners and those facilitating learners connected? The beauty of digital education and digitizing higher education is that the technology can be seen as a facilitator of learning in ways in which it hadn't been. So if we're going to be learning together, how do we foster a shared perspective, and is there a way in which digital transformation can help? When we talk about digital transform the educational experience, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about the technology, which in some ways is considered to be the heart and soul of what digitizing means, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about technology. In a lot of ways, from my perspective, digital technology and digitization is really about the catalyst effect. So we've had technology for a while. I have been working in the field of computer science for 41 years. I have been involved in digitizing education and the ways in which technology can be used for education for about 27 years. So it is not a case of having, this is a new experience for me, And so some of what I say today is going to be framed based on some experience. So I am a computer scientist who is interested in the ways in which adult learners use technology to build their ability to function within their daily life. And the educational context is one of those ways. When we talk about collaboration, what are the things that we are putting into that pot? Collaboration, are we talking about collaboration at every level? Are we talking about collaboration in certain ways? We had some excellent conversations earlier today about personalization, and personalization of learning infers that collaboration is involved. And then, of course, how do we engage in learners? And in some ways, how is it experienced from a faculty perspective, but also how is it experienced from a student's perspective? And where does digitization fit? Next slide, please. So, learners, hey, they're always in motion. They are always learning. They are learning no matter what context they're in. And that's the most fascinating part about it, is the fact that they are learning whether they're in a classroom physically, whether they're in a classroom virtually, whether they're trying to figure out how to put together a piece of furniture, whether or not they are now trying to figure out how to make use of some digital tool to allow them to continue to communicate with their children. If the COVID-19 pandemic has done nothing else, it has pushed people out of their comfort zone and into making use of social networking software in a way in which they couldn't have ever envisioned or imagined 3 years ago. So they're always learning, they're always in motion. Their daily life is full of learning, and they are always making connections to what they already know. They understand this idea of existing knowledge. They know how to do things, but they have to learn how to do things differently. And sometimes there are questions about their own ability come popping out. Now, let's put this in a higher education context. Is anything different? Not really. They're bringing existing knowledge in. They're bringing their own understanding of digitization, their own understanding of digitization, which may or may not be in sync with how everybody else in that teaching and learning environment have it, and in particular faculty. They also are starting to not just think about digitization and higher education and the learning that they do, not just now, but also for the future. Things have really been shaken up a lot. And so when we start talking about learners, to what extent have learners really moved away from saying, right, I'm going to come in, I'm going to get a degree, higher education, the degree is going to look like this, it's going to allow me to do this. All of a sudden now higher education is coming to them and saying, maybe I'm coming in and yes, I will obtain a degree, but what is that really going to mean for me? It isn't just a set of instructions that they follow and sure enough, boom, they have a degree. And that's where collaboration can be picked up. That's where collaboration can start being seen as a way in which it's a joint journey. It's not just one person who's decided what the journey is like and a whole bunch of people following that path. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the opportunities for digitizing and digitally transforming areas of collaboration? So in many ways, there are three focus areas, one of which is engagement within the learning. And we've really been kind of messing around with that for a good 20 years or so. The moment we started doing virtual learning environments, online learning, the traditional online learning, we were starting to say, look, learning can happen not just in one way, but it can be happening in many ways. And the technology we're using can transform how that looks in terms of educational collaboration. So really, we're talking about modality here. And so we have the physical space, we have the online space, we have the blended space, we have the flipped space, you name it, we have it now. But there's also conversations about peer activities and in what way can we make use of digital and digitally transform environments to actually foster an engagement amongst peers, and not just from a team group learning perspective, but also ways in which they can assess each other in the kind of contributions that they're making. But can we do more? And then last but not least, curriculum design and delivery and assessment. That's an area that, you know what, it is ripe for digital transformation. And what I hope to do for the rest of the talk is to show you the ways in which that might be happening. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's see here. We've talked about personalization. We've mentioned it. Here are some things to consider. Choice, issue of agency. How do we customize it? How do we encourage self-management? Then we talk about connecting learners and facilitators, faculty and curriculum together from a participation perspective. We have issues of communication, collaboration, connectivity, community, and then of course we have the other very important P, which is productivity. So is it and should it be learner-centered, content, contribution for knowledge, creativity, innovation? What does this all mean? Well, let's talk about the ways in which technology and digitization might allow us to do more adaptive learning environments. It's already in use, although in a lot of ways people may not be aware of it. So I'll give you an example of Duolingo. If you are interested in learning a new language, what is available to us is Duolingo as an app. That app uses bot-like activity to help us manage our learning in a way that is intuitive for us. It is the ultimate in personalization. If I want to explore a level of another language in a way in which I had not learned it before, Duolingo is there for me to work. It's using a chat technology. We know that there is adaptive testing. We know there is adaptive learning technologies available. There is text to speech translation at a push of a button. After all, we are recording this right now, and there is captioning going on as well. What's interesting, however, is that while it frees up time to do other types of activity, so digitizing is in some ways, is a freeing of time to be reallocated to other types of activity that could be productive and could be ways in which further encourage participation. It is not necessarily systematic. So we don't necessarily know. We have, for example, we know that there are lots of moments of digitization going on, but is there a way in which we could do this in a systematic way that would actively address the needs and show benefits for those involved in the learning environment, namely facilitators and learners? Next slide, please. So when I talk about student engagement, okay, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the notion of a digital habitat. So Wenger has been around a while. He's talked a lot about community of learners. He then put together an idea along with some collaborators of creating a digital habitat. And what would it take to create a digital habitat, maintain a digital habitat, rules of the digital habitat? What are the benefits of being engaged in a digital habitat? So I'm using this as an idea. As a way to think about student engagement. So if you think about these 4 items here that you're more than happy to read and ahead of what I want to say, really we are talking about an environment where digitization, first of all, creates the environment. Secondly, digitization is used as a vehicle to promote activity, as a way that students and faculty jointly create that learning experience as it's understood, just not now, but also down the road. So we have opportunities. For example, we have already teachers that are digitized, meaning that we have humans, and there's been some really interesting studies that's been done that talk about when you put an intelligent tutor in place, what do students value? And one of the interesting things that Kim Merrill, Zhu, and Selno found out when they were conducting their study was that students really appreciate having an intelligent agent. I use the quotes intelligent agent there as an alternative, because as they connect to this intelligent agent, what they're seeing is they're relating to it as a human. So they see the value of connecting to an intelligent agent, even though they know it's an intelligent agent, because that intelligent agent is bringing to the place of connection an element of humanism. Okay. So in the asynchronous world, let me step back for a second. In the asynchronous world, we talk a great deal about the notion of presence. For all the years that I've been working with online tutors, we've talked a lot about how important it is for faculty to create a digital presence. So what is it? So when a student connects to the asynchronous world, that faculty person has created a presence. And what does that mean for that faculty person? What is it about themselves that they want to make sure they convey to the students who are engaged in an asynchronous environment? When we move to synchronous environment or a blended environment, asynchronous and synchronous, that digital presence doesn't go away. That concept of presence doesn't go away. So the original model of presence is still very much involved. So online learning presence, the teaching presence. But what has become really, really important is social presence, which was not really part of the original model from 1999, but as research has been conducted, we have now understand that social presence is a critical element of maintaining any kind of digital learning environment, no matter what modality you use. So what it ends up being, of course, is now a foundational conception. In other words, it is a critical foundation piece upon which many digitization efforts has been placed. So we talked earlier about bots. Duolingo has a bot. There's something called a snatch bot. If you haven't gone out and looked at what snatch bots do, please do so. What we're really doing is we're now saying, look, let's make use of some of this advanced technology to foster engagement, to provide support to students in a manner that still feels as if, and in actual fact, engages in human-like contributions, but is supportive to students. So we've had a lot of technology being deployed. We've had a lot of simple technology being deployed, but the question becomes, to what extent can we deploy the more complex technology? We understand that there is opportunity now in a way that we had never considered before. And I will point to two examples. If you've gone to any immersive art show, I was at the immersive Van Gogh show recently. Amazing to actually feel like you're a part of the painting experience. If you are familiar with the Holocaust Memory Project, where you can stand and have conversations with, in essence, people who have long since died, and yet you can ask them questions about their experience. These are amazing technologies that foster learning at a much deeper level. They are our future if we want to start talking about digitizing. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about making use of AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, which is another version of AI. It's a particularly focused on decision making. And let's talk a little bit about AI in the classroom as a vehicle by which we can digitally transform student-peer engagement. So students are amazing in how they go out and find tools that will help them work within a digital environment, and also within a digital environment that requires them to engage with one another. In other words, the focus is no longer on the facilitator, the focus is on the actual experience across students. Okay. The very first thing that comes up when anybody talks about group work, teamwork, what do you like about group work? I really enjoy the fact that I get to work with people to create something, as an answer. What is it you don't care about teamwork? I hate the issue of slackers who don't contribute and one person takes over control. In other words, the engagement piece, which is really interesting, to have both of those happening at the same time. So one of the potential uses of AI is to make it infused into teamwork in a way in which accountability can be captured. Okay. It could be used in unique ways. So, for example, by discipline. So, what does a computer scientist need? What does a nursing clinical engagement piece need? For example, what does a business environment need when they're working on a group project? What it could be used for is it could be used as a way to create a reality, in other words, an environment where the engagement's going on, but the engagement's going on in a meaningful way from an accountability perspective. In other words, it isn't just the actual work that's being done by the students, but also it is capturing the essence of the collaboration. It could be used for assessment. It could be used to provide feedback. It could be used in a manner that is meaningful for the students. So they are not just sitting down and saying, right, we're working on a team project, but we could use advanced technologies as a vehicle around supporting a learning community. In other words, encouraging learning communities in a way that is not as easy to do. And I have an example I'll give you in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. Now, I want to focus a little bit more on curriculum design and then give you an example of how that has been working for me. Because I teach on campus and I teach online. So I, often will take some of these new ideas and try them out to see how it works. So if we are thinking that students and faculty should be working as collaborators, the underlying principle or the inherently expectation of constructiveness as a pedagogy is important. So one of the things that is an important, I feel is an important piece is that if you are not one who thinks of curriculum design in a constructivist way, this is probably going to be a little more challenging. Okay, so I could see how this might be a big stretch for some faculty of whom I work with on a regular basis. But I'm a constructivist thinker, so I see the curriculum build as a constructivist opportunity. Interesting thing is that we know that students are adaptable. We've certainly seen it over the last few years. Pinkerton in 2018 talked a lot about adaptability of students. Well, boy, have we seen this in spades. We've forced them into being adaptable. Some students, not so much. But we've had to move past the requirement to be able to salvage what was left of one academic year and then spend almost an entire second academic year looking at how we can transform using digital technologies, how we could transform what in essence we had expected to do one way into a new way. So when we think about student collaborators, it's not a new concept, okay? It's not, but it does expect that students have a sense of accountability, that we recognize that students have a level of autonomy, because it's a really interesting idea that if you're going to work within a constructive mode and you're going to think about curriculum, then you really need to get students or think about students, encouraging students to build up their sense of autonomy. You can't say we want you to collaborate and then turn around and not let them do it because we've taken away their autonomy. Okay. What I've found to be very fascinating, is the ways in which students will naturally integrate and digitally transform themselves and their work if given an opportunity. And they do it in a natural way using the tools that happen to be available to them at the time. So the challenge with curriculum and collaboration with faculty and students is to free up what's available. Let them use their own choices, give them the autonomy to say, right, this digital environment would suit how we want to approach whatever learning task it is that you've asked them or they have chosen to do. What I find is fascinating here is this notion of expert knowledge and professional accreditation. So I live in the world where computing technology requires professional accreditation, and yet what they're really seeking is wisdom. And I could get onto another tangent about wisdom, but I'll leave it there. But there's an inherent amount of wisdom that we may be able to foster coming from our students if we put them in a mode that allows them to use their autonomy as collaborators within a constructivist environment. Next slide, please. By the way, students see high value in this. Now, I thought I'd put this out here. This is, an old classic. Bulvel and Bully, adapted from Arnstein's notion of how students could increasingly become part of the collaboration and be seen as collaboration and contributors to that curriculum within a higher education environment. So I'll just give you a second to have a look at that, but you'll notice control increasingly disappears. Students control decision making and have substantial influence. That's where potentially we could go. Next slide. All right. So now what I have is I have an opportunity to talk about students as digital people, but what I want to do is really talk about a particular environment. So, for example, if we were to do a artificial intelligence like environments, okay, so where do you bring in the intelligence support? What ways could we bring them in to foster student collaboration? What are the ways in which students take their autonomy and build their learning in a way that's meaningful to them and to which they see value? Okay, so here's an example. It's really hard to let go. And I know that students at the end of a particular course set need to be able to demonstrate the following, and I can just list them all off for you. I know that the best way to do that is through collaborative team projects. I understand that I could set the direction and I could walk them through the technological implications. I know that at the end, they should be able to do this. And I believe that they say at the end, based on evaluations, that they really, really enjoy the end result. It's a totally different story when you give them control. And so my work in this last 2 years has been to digitally transform what students say is a very meaningful activity. It's a team project where I give them some direction in the fall, but in the spring, it's basically them. And I have to tell you, it's scary. There are days where I look over and I think, are they really moving where they need to by this time? And the answer is not necessarily. But what I have given them as a result of making this decision is to say, I will give you some guided design. I will give you some added, I will recognize the importance of confidence and motivation. I will free you up to make choices as to how you go about doing it, but I'll always make sure that there is some level of assessment that can be measurable outcomes. So you can be confident that you've achieved what you need to achieve. And then I have to, of course, show the university that you've done it as well. And here's what's happened. Time has no longer become the factor in how things are done. Next slide. What's happened is we now have, I have given away probably 95% the locus of control and choice. I've encouraged their agency. That means, therefore, that I sometimes pop into some of their digital tools that they're using. I pop in at 11 o'clock at night just to see what's going on, and I get notified when they are doing things, and sometimes it's 2 o'clock in the morning, but they're in control of when they do it and how they do it. What's been interesting is that they've turned around and they have become more supportive of each other's discoveries. One person wanted to go out and try a technology, wasn't really sure if it would work, went out and reported back on what that person learned. And that caused others to go out and go look. And then we had a conversation in class about the commonalities of their discoveries and how it related back to one of the goals of the course. Peers are now using feed forward. They are thinking about not just the feedback that they're giving each other as they're working together, but they're also anticipating down the road. So I had somebody send me a note the other night. Well, we use Discord as one of our topics, and I have it set to read the note out to me. And I was in the middle of a meeting, if you can believe it, with my condominium association, and out from my computer comes Discord reading out what the student had said. Now, you can imagine that was a little disconcerting for the members of the condo executive board, but the student had reported back some of the discoveries, and the other students had responded back to those discoveries. But he was anticipating something down the road that he could actively, proactively engage in. Their engagement as team members has changed because of the fact that they have embraced their autonomy and they are in control of how this project works. So it's not always quite as prescriptive as it seems. So even though I have a vision as to how I think it's supposed to work, by giving them control and by encouraging their supportive nature, I have in effect said, you go out and learn what you believe is the most critical pieces as part of this project. That is not easy to do. I am not encouraging it in any way, shape, or form. I know that I understand it will work, but boy, it's scary. I got to tell you, as a faculty person, it's pretty darn scary. But what I'm seeing happen is amazing. It's just amazing. So when I think about digital transformation, I'm thinking about this kind of stuff where they are embracing, I'm using digital environments and allowing them to move forward in a way that, quite frankly, I wouldn't have done 5 years ago, even though I've been involved in computer science for so long. But as an educator, I'm not sure I really embrace the way digitizing could feed into this constructive views of learning. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, Kathleen.
Great. So what we really are talking about here, of course, is removing the common requirement for shared physical or virtual space. And as you can see, this whole notion of spontaneity, this whole notion of ease of use of collaborative tools, fostering sharing thoughts, being able to make use of digital environments to foster collaboration. And the faculty person truly is, in many ways, the guide on the side now. And we talk about it a lot, but man, oh man, it's much harder to do in person. Next slide. I could not leave you today without giving you some things to think about. First of all, the notion of a workbench is a really nice one for me. It works well for me. But there are lots of ways in which we are still, if we're going to embrace more complex digital technologies beyond just delivery, we're really going to have to do some hard thinking about the ethical use of advanced technologies. You know, in 2020, the OECD put together a listing of some of the ways in which we have to ethically think about our use of AI and machine learning, ML, and then also the ways in which we might use deep learning. So if AI is used for predictive work and machine learning allows us to come up with the reasons for decisions, that's all lovely. But we need to also think about, even though it might give us more information, what are we doing with that data? How are we using deep learning for multiple layers? How could we use real-time feedback? So for example, a study that was just completed this last year, there is a business program, and what they have done is they've made use of learning analytics to feed forward to the facilitators real-time information about how well the peers are working, in a way that they could allow them to make immediate adjustments to the facilitation part of the teamwork. We need to think in terms of ethically, how do we do this? How do we employ complex digital technologies? How do we employ digital learning environments in a way that's ethically responsible and yet still provides the kind of support that we want to here in a higher education environment? Next slide, please. So my challenge to all of you is to have further conversations about this. As you are thinking about the technologies available and digitizing and using faculty and students as collaborators, what are the other things that have to go along with that decision? Okay. And thank you so much for inviting me today. It was a pleasure to be involved with the University of Lincoln once again.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was very, very interesting. Such a different approach. And it's invoked quite a bit of conversation in the chat. So I'll try and summarize some of the comments and see what your thoughts are. So um, enlightening students to sort of embrace this when they've come from very taught or didactic educational background. So how do we enlighten students sufficiently so that they can acknowledge this curriculum design?
That's a fabulous question, and I can share with you some of my own experience. We have had situations in the past where we've had students who have been cast in passive mode in high school. Now, we've been fortunate in that our high school educational system has been shifting to a more constructive approach, and because they've shifted in a constructive way, it has allowed the students to start thinking about themselves as owners of their learning as opposed to as receivers. However, what's interesting though is this infusion of consumerism into higher education. And so what we're trying to do now is as they come into the higher ed environment, we are actively addressing it. In other words, we're not letting it just kind of happen. Some of it was because of COVID. Some of it we just simply, the pandemic forced us to rethink what we were doing in terms of orientation, and that has allowed us to be consistent in the way we look at these things. We've also done a lot of work with our feeder institutions, so anywhere where the students are coming from. We've also gone to find out how they're handling issues around student learner autonomy, and the ways in which students are taking on and embracing their own roadmap for learning.
Thank you. If anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question, I'll go to another one off the discussion chat for now. If anyone raises their hand, we can go to you. Chris from comments, and his last one's not really a question, it's more a comment, and interested in your view. So depending on the subject requirements, my assumption for adaptive learning is that you still need a degree of scaffolding. In his area of veterinary medicine, where you need to be able to
Right.
achieve a certain number of competencies,
Mhm.
the idea of letting students roam free is terrifying.
Oh, it's terrifying, even if you've got it under control or you think you have it under control. But here's the reality. The reality is students are never completely under control. You're right, professional accreditation. So I have that in computer science, right? Our students we have 100% placement into positions. They also do internships. I can appreciate veterinary medicine, the amount of science involved in veterinary medicine. So that's where the guiding comes into play. So you're not letting them completely loose in terms of designing. What you are doing though is so this is what I do. If you provide to them, look, in your path to accreditation, here are some of the things that you will be required, right, to understand and be able to demonstrate competencies in. Let's talk about how we can get you there. Let's talk about how you're going to get there. Let's talk about the vehicles in which we're going to use to get to allow you to acquire what you need. That's how I've been doing it. So at the end of the day, I'm still required. I mean, we're still under contract. After all, the university promises a degree program. And if you have my colleagues in nursing, for example, they have as with veterinary medicine, very prescriptive exams. They have to get through those exams or they're not going to be qualified. But what they have learned to do is they have learned to use narrative, for example, as a vehicle for learning. Now, when you do narrative as a pedagogical approach, you are encouraging students to bring their own life experiences in the clinics as teaching moments. So in other words, the faculty is still in charge, meaning the faculty is still facilitating that opportunity, but the students themselves actually design the case studies and the ways in which they use narrative as a vehicle for understanding their work in the clinics.
That's super. I can't see any other questions. I think those haven't covered. So I think what I'd be interested to hear from you, we've got a few minutes left, is
Mhm.
given all the presentations we've heard today, a lot have been about how we've adapted over the pandemic. How will you ensure we don't slip back into our own ways? How are we going to move forward on the learnings we've made over the last couple of years?
Well, first of all, I believe that faculty who have moved forward should be given positions where they can encourage others to move forward in recognizing that things are never going to go back to the way they were before. Students are not the same. Faculty are not the same. This is a personal comment, Emma, more than anything else. You know, I hear occasionally people saying, "Oh, it'll be so nice when things go back to normal." Okay, well, define normal. Okay, define normal, because the reality is things will never, we are always in motion. So I said earlier today, you know, learners are always in motion. They're always learning new things. They're always adapting to whatever it is that they're expected to understand. We all do that as individuals. So that's the human piece of us, right? If we have faculty who would like to just go back to the way they always did things, and recognize that that's a tendency, it's a human tendency. The difficulty is we have students who aren't. Our students will never be the way they were 3 years ago. They just won't. Their life experience has radically changed. And I speak from two levels of experience. I speak from an experience of somebody who has 5 grandchildren, and I've seen the effect it's had on them as learners. And the way they've embraced digital technologies and the ways in which they think some aspects of digital technologies, the way they were deployed, were really awful. And they will say so. They were really awful. They aren't just tolerant of it. But I also speak in terms of maturation. So we have a group of students who did not have the in-campus experience. So that first year of maturation that we typically expect will happen didn't happen. And so one of the things that we did was when they all did finally come back to campus, we had to adapt. We had to recognize that where they were in a maturation process. We couldn't just assume just because they were a second year meant that they had actually built up the maturation pieces that we would normally expect. Guess what? They built up different maturation. The thing is, they built up different maturation processes. It wasn't that so students aren't going to be the same. And I would say to my colleagues who are struggling with the fact that things aren't going back to the way they used to be, to say, but if you think about yourself as a faculty member, when you first started, what were you like? What have you learned? Isn't this great that you have an opportunity to learn even more? I mean, I tend to be a much more supportive faculty member, but some of that's because I've been doing faculty development for so long and trying to bring faculty along, right, to new ways of thinking about engaging with students. Most of us do it. We don't do it for the money. We do it because we love working with students.